Okay, folks, we are going to get started since it is a couple minutes past noon. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm Larissa Vigu-Picard, Executive Director of Pejepscot History Center, and we're very pleased to have what is obviously an extremely popular topic and talk today, the history of Hunter Tavern in Topsham. We're really excited to be able to offer this program. And I know it's going to be a really well done, comprehensive program because I know Jim's work, having had the pleasure of working with him for several years here on different projects. So I know you're in for a very informative lunch break afternoon. A couple things that I want to mention first. We are recording this, so I hope that's okay for everybody. But if you don't feel comfortable being on screen, you can turn your video off. This is not a webinar system, so I would encourage you. Jim will, of course, be the only speaker when I turn it over to him, but if you prefer, you can also go up to the right-hand corner of the screen and on his thumbnail and pin the speaker. If you choose pin, you will primarily see him as he is doing the talk. So I have everyone on mute now. Jim, once I turn it over to him, will unmute himself and share his screen and start his presentation. But if you can please stay on mute unless you have an urgent question. Speaking of questions, please put questions for Jim in the chat box. We have so many people in the program today that's how we're going to handle the Q&A at the end. So if you could please just put them in there, and I will be moderating that at the end of Jim's presentation, and we'll try to get to as many as we can, depending on how much time we have left and how many questions are in there. It would be lovely to be able to take some verbal questions. We'll see, depending on what shows up in the chat box. We may or may not be able to do that, but of course, you know, if we can do that, you can raise your hand or you can use the hand raise icon on the Zoom screen. I do want to thank everybody so much for choosing to be with us today. Many of you are members, but we do have many new faces and names today, which is very exciting. And I just want to say that this is a free program. Jim is doing this out of the goodness of his heart as well, which we really appreciate. But we're able to do things like this and use staff time because of member support and donor support, and we greatly appreciate that. If you're interested in becoming a member and you're not, or interested in giving to our annual fund, I have conveniently put in the chat box a link to our Give page on our website. I've also put in there our info@pejepscothistorical.org email. If you did not find out about this program on our e-news, which we send out monthly, you can send a message to that info email and ask to be added to our e-news. And that is a great way of staying up to date on all the programs that we're offering. I'm going to just tell you about one upcoming program, and then we're going to get this program started. We have a very exciting program on April 15th. It is a conversation between Lisa Brooks, who is a professor of English and American Studies at Amherst College and the author of Our Beloved Kin, A New History of King Philip's War, which came out a couple of years ago. She's going to be in conversation with Professor of History Joe Hall from Bates. They have both done and are continuing to do a lot of groundbreaking research and scholarship on Wabanaki and Indigenous lives in and throughout New England. Joe has worked a lot with students to map Wabanaki place names around Maine, including in our region. And Lisa has really, she won a prize for that book, and she has really been doing some amazing research. So we're excited to have them in conversation with one another. That is a ticketed program. It's a 6:30 in the evening program on April 15th. And that information is right on our website on the events page, and we would love to have you sign up for that. All right, without further ado, I am going to introduce to you Jim St. Pierre. We'll do a little bio here and then turn it over to him. Jim has degrees in natural resources and liberal arts from the University of Maine, and he has held a number of leadership positions in various state agencies and nonprofit conservation organizations in Maine. Since 2009, he's been editor of the Maine Environmental News website, and he has created and presented numerous talks, slideshows for us, but for many other organizations. He also curated an exhibit for the town of Brunswick, a traveling exhibit that started here and went to the library and the high school and the town office in 2019 about the 300th anniversary of the town commons. A really, really well done exhibit. And he's been a member of many different organizations. He is a very enthusiastic local historian and does really great, meticulous research. So I am going to now turn it over to Jim. I will mute myself. I'll monitor the chat box, and we will look forward to having a really wonderful presentation. Jim St. Pierre.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to try to share my screen. And you should be seeing the first slide.
That looks perfect, Jim.
Okay, great. So thanks everybody for coming today. Whenever I give a presentation, I like to look up what happened on this day in history. So I looked up March 25th, and the most interesting thing I found was 1807, March 25, King George signed a law banning the slave trade in England, although it was another 26 years before the practice of slavery was abolished there. So that was a significant event in history. But today we're going to talk about the Hunters. The Hunters are one of the oldest settler families in Topsham. And what I know is what I've discovered in the written record. There may be some members of the family here today, and if you have additional or better stories, I hope you'll share them. I have what I found is basically interesting information in the record about one of the first inns in colonial Topsham, John Hunter's Tavern. So I'm going to, and first I think it's important to say that while descendants of settlers from away have been in this region for generations now, including mine, this area is the traditional homeland of the Wabanaki people. In fact, on the Hunter Farm, where John Hunter was born, archaeologists have found evidence that in prehistoric times, beginning around 3,000 years ago, humans gathered along the river at a spot where a ledge creates a schooling place for salmon and other fish. But that's another story, another slideshow for some other day. We need to take the Wayback Machine to get into a 17th century mindset. So remember that from the 1620s to 1676, several settlements in colonial Maine thrived. In this area, Thomas Purchase was racing among his huts at Pejepscot Falls on the Androscoggin River, to the falls 10 miles upriver, to his hut at Mere Point and back. And then King Philip's War raged throughout New England as Native American tribes sought to turn back the English occupiers. Mr. Purchase was driven out, and most of Maine's settlements were completely destroyed or badly damaged. The war ushered in nearly a century of bloody strife between the British on one side and the French and the Wabanaki on the other. And as a result, no 17th century buildings remain in Maine. However, by the early 1700s, European settlement was restarting in the District of Maine. And there are even a few 18th century taverns still standing, including, as you can see in some of the pictures, the Burnham Tavern in Machias, and closer to us, the Pownellborough Courthouse in Dresden, the Shepherd Inn in Bath, the Eaton Tar House in Harpswell, and the Jameson Tavern in Freeport. So try to imagine what life was like here on the frontier. The forested lands were the habitat of a wide variety of native species. Most transportation was by water. The few land travel ways were trails or rough dirt paths, and then slightly improved gravel stagecoach roads. Houses were log cabins or basic wood structures. Meeting houses were multiple use community centers, which often served as a town hall, a church, and a courthouse. Taverns and inns were commonly called ordinaries. In her book, Old New England Inns, Mary Crawford wrote, quote, "Colonial inns were bound up with the Puritan church. Usually the ordinary was next door to the meeting house. Often such proximity was the single condition upon which permits to sell beer were granted. Physical and mental discomfort attended church going. Since there was no fire in the meeting house, it was necessary to continued existence that the good people who had come from miles away to worship should feel a cheerful place to thaw out between the cold drive and the chilly service. The ordinary could sell many a mug of the potent flip, invaluable for raising spirits which had been depressed by dreary discourses." So by the late 17th century, Maine had been absorbed by Massachusetts. Taverns and ordinaries had so multiplied that the Puritan minister Cotton Mather complained in 1765 that every other house in Boston was an alehouse. A century later, in 1770, settlers in Harpswell were so alarmed that they voted, quote, "If any professor," meaning church member, "shall unnecessarily frequent any tavern on the Lord's day, or there repair with a view needlessly to drink spirituous liquor, or shall at any time be guilty of drunkenness or drinking to excess, he or she shall come under the censure of this church." The situation was probably not much different by the 19th century, but Henry David Thoreau had a different perspective. He wrote, quote, "The tavern shall compare favorably with the church. The church is the place where prayers and sermons are delivered, but the tavern is where they are to take effect. And if the former are good, the latter cannot be bad." So in sort of a twist of irony, in the Wheelers' history, they say that weekly meetings of the Washington Total Abstinence Society of Brunswick were held in the old tavern which stood on the site of the present post office and engine house. So what was life like at taverns in the 1700s and 1800s? Well, taverns could be fun. In their History of Brunswick area, the Wheelers say that Alexander Rogers, the second husband of Mrs. John Hunter, who we'll hear more about, kept a tavern in Bowden, which was a, quote, "resort for lunch and grog on Sunday noons of all who attended meetings in the old East Meeting House." Taverns could be convenient. In the 1830s, Nathaniel Green kept a tavern in the Haldenfrost House in Topsham, quote, "to accommodate persons attending court next door. Scofflaws who lost their legal case could dull their pain in the tavern." Taverns could be useful. Edward Field, in his book, The Colonial Tavern, says all news emanated from the tavern. Taverns could be serious. The Rogers Tavern in Bowden, another tavern in Bowdenham, run by their in-laws, the Mustards, and some of the taverns in Brunswick served as a muster ground where every able man of the age 18 to 45 was compelled by law to drill in military tactics 4 times a year. And being MIA, or missing in action, could bring a heavy fine. Taverns could be risky. On July 8, 1826, Dinsmore's Tavern in Topsham was destroyed by fire. A year later, on November 7th, 1827, a stage tavern kept by Charles Rogers burned. According to Wheeler's history, quote, "several travelers who were passing the night there had barely time to leave their beds and get out, unclad, into the deep, newly fallen snow. And in August 1835, a violent storm pelted Mustard's Tavern with hailstones 3 inches in diameter. And taverns could be annoying. One time, a farmer was taking butter, beans, and dead hogs to Portland. He stayed overnight at a tavern near Bowdoin College. In the morning, he discovered his cart was missing. After a desperate search, his wagon and goods were located. They were resting on the ridgepole on the top of one of the college buildings where Bowdoin students had somehow hoisted the cart as a prank. It had to be taken apart to get it down. And finally, taverns could be exciting. In 1796 or 7, Talleyrand, the distinguished French priest and political character, was visiting this country. He was traveling from Castine to Boston, and when he passed through Brunswick, as a visiting dignitary, he spent the greater part of a day at a public house kept by Captain John Dunlap. The conversation must have been thrilling. So the first taverns in this area were operated as early as the 1740s. In Brunswick, the Pejepska proprietors offered to grant land as an incentive, quote, to erect a house for the entertainment of travelers on Brunswick Plain. Robert Spear took up the offer and operated a tavern west of the meeting house from about 1744 to 1760. In Topsham, Colonel Samuel Winchell took in strangers in the 1740s and 50s in his public house at Cathants. And at least 5 others were licensed as innholders in Topsham in the 1760s. So I don't expect you to be able to read this slide, but I wanted to show that I have scoured the Wheelers' history of Brunswick and Topsham. In Brunswick, they reference at least 7 taverns in colonial times and dozens more after the American Revolution through the 1860s. They mention 36 taverns, inns, or licensed innholders in Topsham from 1750 to 1845. But it appears that the first real tavern was operated by John Hunter around 1770. And the rest of this talk is about the Hunter Tavern. So Adam Hunter, John Hunter's father, was born in Boston in about 1709. He apparently came to Topsham as a youngster in about 1717, probably with relatives as part of a wave of Scots-Irish immigrants who were enticed to settle here by Robert Temple. While most of the white settlers left after a devastating Wabanaki raid in 1722, Adam Hunter was one of the few who stayed. Adam Hunter was said to be one of the most prosperous of the early settlers in Topsham. He purchased 2 lots of 100 acres each from the Pejepska proprietors for £5 apiece. He also appears to have owned 2 other lots. In addition, he was one of the owners of the Cathants millwright, owning 125 acres and 1/8 of a double sawmill. He became a man of means. His house was said to be the best in town. Strangers were sometimes directed there for accommodations. In 1731, Adam Hunter married Mary Lithgow in Georgetown. That probably means Bath, because Bath didn't separate from colonial Georgetown in Maine until half a century later. Mary Lithgow was of Irish descent, probably from County Derry. She came to this country when she was 10 years old. Records show that a girl named Mary Lithgow was with her family on the ship Olive, which landed in Boston in 1719. Between 1733 and 1749, Adam and Mary Hunter had 10 children. In 1746, Adam Hunter served as a captain or a company clerk during King George's War, one of the so-called Indian Wars that was fought between 1675 and 1759 between the native Wabanaki and the occupying British. Adam Hunter also served as Topsham treasurer in 1764 at the first town meeting and as a selectman in 1766. He was a pillar of the community. He was also something else, a rabble-rouser. In 1760, the clerk for the proprietors wrote that, quote, "There are some in Topsham who deny the title of the Pejepscot Company, the ringleaders being Captain Adam Hunter and Captain Thomas Wilson. There are pirates here who have made their living out of the proprietors by destroying the lumber, and there are none so guilty as that said Hunter who has got an estate out of those woods." So John Hunter was born on the Hunter farm on the Foreside Road in Topsham on July 13th, 1743. He was the seventh of the 10 kids of Adam Hunter and Mary Lithgow. When he was 22 in 1765, John married Margaret Wilson. They had 2 sons, William and Adam, and a daughter, Anne. Only William survived to adulthood. Around the late 1760s, John acquired Lot 38 from the Pejepscot proprietors, and he built a large wood house facing south on the north side of Middlesex Road, which was about 2 miles from the old Topsham Town Hall in the village. Middlesex Road at that time would have been really little more than a dirt horse path between Topsham and Bodenham. It was not yet even a stagecoach road, since public transit by horse-drawn coach didn't arrive until after the Revolution. But around 1770, John and Margaret became part of the travel industry, turning their home into a tavern and inn. John would have been familiar with taking in temporary boarders after seeing his father and mother do that. Tradition says that people would ride to John and Margaret Hunter's inn from Topsham village down on the Androscoggin River, and the last person to arrive had to treat everyone else, probably to a round of drinks. So think how hard living must have been here then. It was just a few years after Britain and France had signed a treaty which ended their long-running war. All the French claims to lands in North America, including those across the Kennebec River, were suddenly surrendered to the British. And it was just a few years before the American colonies were to declare independence from and war on Britain, the mother country with the most powerful military on the planet. And Topsham was on the front line of these world events. Like his father, John Hunter was an important figure in early Topsham history. Topsham was growing. It had been a township since 1717, but it incorporated as a town in 1764. Some of the early town meetings were held in the Hunter Tavern because it was warmer there in March than in the meeting house in the village. John Hunter even served as town clerk from 1773 to 1775. The Hunter's Tavern was a typical mid-18th century wood frame building. It measured 20.5 feet by 40 feet with a fieldstone foundation and full cellar. It had 2 stories, and the siding was hand-split clapboards. The earliest image, well, I just showed you, the earliest image we have of the Hunter's Tavern is this woodcut engraving in the Wheeler's History of Brunswick and Topsham. It was published in 1878. By then, the tavern had been around for more than a century, which is pretty impressive feat in an era when wood buildings often burned. The Wheelers, in their history, said it was probably the oldest house then standing in Topsham. They called it the Old Red House. A really interesting architectural survey was done in 1962 and found that traces of red paint were still visible on the outside boards. So I put up the tombstones here to tell you a little what happened to Adam and John Hunter. John Hunter died in mid-January of 1776. I have not found any record that he was a soldier during the American Revolution, but there was a major conflict underway in the colonies, as you may recall. That same month, Thomas Paine published his provocative pamphlet, Common Sense, which more than any other publication paved the way for the Declaration of Independence 6 months later and a seismic shift in British America to a war aiming to separate nations. Maybe it was the stress of dealing with the Pejepsket proprietors, or raising a family on the edge of the frontier, or running the tavern business, or serving as a town official, or trying to survive another Maine winter. Maybe it was all of those pressures or others. I don't know what did him in. Maybe it was disease. He was only 32 years old. His father, Adam, reportedly died the next month on February 27th, 1776, on a British prison ship as one of more than 11,000 captured patriots. He was 67 years old. Adam's widow, Mary, ended up remarrying to David Dunning of Brunswick 11 years later in 1787. The graves of both John and Adam Hunter are said to be in Topsham's First Parish Cemetery just down the road from the site of the Hunter Tavern. When John Hunter died in the winter of 1776, his widow, Margaret, was left to care for a couple of boys, 5 and 10 years old. She ran the tavern for years with little help. There's a story that a man named Pike showed up one day in tattered clothes. He pleaded with the widow Hunter to let him remain and help work the farm. She agreed, giving him food and clothing. To show his gratitude, Pike supposedly said that he would stay as long as a single shingle remained on the roof. At the turn of the 19th century, Margaret, who had been a widow by that time for a quarter century, remarried. According to the Wheelers' history, by 1804, Margaret and her second husband, Alexander Rogers of Georgetown, kept a tavern a mile up the road at a new place. Margaret died in 1831. Alexander lived another 15 years after that. After stagecoach runs were established from Brunswick north, the Hunter Tavern may still have served as an inn, though there are reports that most of the travelers stayed overnight at the inns in Brunswick. By the 1930s, Hunter Tavern was not only still standing, it had the distinction of being the oldest house in Topsham. So where precisely was the tavern? The earliest relevant deed in the Saginaw County Registry is dated 1854. It describes the lot as adjacent to property of Wilson P. Hunter and including Jane P. Frost's father's homestead, which was conveyed to Dorothy Atkins. A map of Topsham, published just 4 years later in 1858, shows two buildings, one belonging to W. Hunter and the other to J. Atkins. The chain of title shows that the Hunter Tavern was deeded to Charles Levitt in 1889, and then to Letty Levitt in 1937, to Guy Levitt in 1949, and to Carl and Marjorie Randall in 1965. So this 1962 map shows the Hunter Tavern was on Middlesex Road at the corner of what, in an amazing coincidence, is now called Old Tavern Road. The map looks sideways here, but I put it so north is at the top for easy orientation. We can zoom in a little bit. This enlargement shows more precisely the location of the tavern on Middlesex Road. Sorry, we don't have any pictures of the Hunters from the 18th century. We do have pictures of the Hunters Tavern, however. As I mentioned, in 1962, the National Park Service conducted an architectural assessment of the building as part of an historic American building survey. Their report is in the Library of Congress, which the rest of the pictures I will show you were taken from. The structural frame of the building was hand-hewn logs. On the outside, the clapboards were attached with handmade nails. The building was surrounded by open fields. On the inside, on the first floor, large rooms ran the depth of the building, opening to a central entryway with stairs against a chimney wall. The floorboards varied from 6 inches to 2.5 feet wide. They were likely pumpkin pine. Brick fireplace hearths were used for cooking. The walls had hair plaster over lath above, vertical wainscoting below. There was a small room at the rear of the chimney. Basement stairs were entered from the room on the east side, and in a romantic touch, the door to the east room had a heart-shaped opening in the doorhead. Upstairs, originally there were 2 rooms opening from the front hall. Later, the room on the east side was partitioned. The attic was a single, unfinished space. So by the 1960s, the Hunter Tavern was in rough shape. It was destroyed in 1965, just 3 years after the architectural survey documented that it was one of the most significant historic structures in Topsham. Reportedly, the Topsham Fire Department burned it for practice. This is what the site looks like now. So there's an old poem I found that seems relevant here, and I'll just read a little part of it. No longer the host hobbles down from his rest in the porch's cool shadows to welcome his guest. With a smile of delight and a grasp of the hand and a glance of the eye that no heart could withstand. Oh, the songs they would sing and the tales they would spin as they lounged in the light of the old-fashioned inn. But the day came at last when the stage brought no load to the gate as it rolled up the long, dusty road. So Topsham was never a major resort destination, but over the years, there have been other tourist accommodations in town. But the Hunter's Tavern certainly had one of the most interesting histories. And although the people and the buildings in the story are gone, it seems important to remember their lives. So thank you for listening to this presentation.
Jim, thank you so much. I saw some hand clapping and some thumbs up. So that was great. And we really, really appreciate you doing that wonderful research and bringing that history community gathering place back to life. It's a shame that it was taken down and there's not really any part of it left, but this kind of research and stories, keep it in all of our memories. So it's really wonderful. Thank you. I do see a comment in the chat box here. I wish I had the picture with me that shows the current location. I live in the house across the street from the property, which can be seen in one of the pictures of the tavern. The picture of the current location that was shown here is incorrect. Ella, if you want to, Jim, if you would maybe go back to that location. And Ella, if you wanted to unmute yourself and say a little bit more.
Yeah, I want to be accurate.
Hi.
Hello. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm at my office and we were so enjoying this. My friend here is also from the local area and we were just ecstatic. We're like, this is so wonderful.
Oh, great.
just to let you know. So yeah, my sister's my sister's on it too. So the picture that you had shown of the back side of the tavern, which I
Back.
had never seen, it was very exciting. Yes,
This-
see in the lower left,
Yes.
of that little house right there. That's my house. I live there.
Aha.
And the next door is the Levante location, and they are also a family still lives there. Anyway, I live in this little house at the bottom of the screen, and across the street from that is my parents' home,
Aha.
and their house is the big blue house on Middlesex.
It's right at the end of the loop road.
On the loop road. Yeah, this is my sister.
And that was the site of the Hunter Tavern. When my brother and I were younger, we would walk through like all the woods that are out back that are, it's developed now. And we would find things from the tavern that had
Oh.
survived from when it was demolished and when there was like a burning that happened. But what's interesting is there was a string of Levitts that owned the tavern. When you were going through your history of the ones that owned it, my family's name is Levitt, but we're not the same branch on the Levitt tree as the ones that had been there. We tried to decide it. And my brother, who graduated from Brunswick in 1972, he did a 200-year history of the Hunter Tavern, and it was covered by like the Times Record. So he was in the newspaper of his little historical paper about the Hunter Tavern where our house was built on.
That's fantastic. Jim, I bet you're going to drive out to that site and take a new picture, aren't you?
Yeah, I was going on the best information on the map that I had, but that's great to have this information, and I'll try to find the news article that you just mentioned.
Oh, we're excited to share that.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
This
Is there
was a
any-
great presentation. This is an excellent presentation. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else that has a comment or wants to ask a question?
I have a comment.
Sure.
The other day I was speaking to a friend who actually told me that he has the sign that was on the Hunter Tavern, and his father took it off the Hunter Tavern before they burned it.
Well, Charlie, you should let him know that there are places to donate things like that.
I asked him if he wanted to sell it, and he said he might, but I haven't seen it. But I asked him to show it to me. So this was just 2 days ago. Very interesting.
Oh, excellent.
So
Good to know.
this morning I was looking at the photo from the Park Service survey, which shows the front. Let me see if I can find that right here. There's a sign,
He has that sign.
and I was trying to zoom in to read the sign, but it wasn't enough resolution. Couldn't read it.
Well, the top looks like it says for sale, and then the bottom looks like it's some sort of a landmark sign. And I don't know if it was historical, other than it might have been put up, maybe 30s or 40s or something like that, identifying it as a landmark. But it is currently still surviving, which is good.
Well, that would be, I guess, the last artifact from the tavern, and it would be a historic artifact now.
I
Absolutely.
also have a few documents that I'm going to share with the Historical Society because in going through papers, I actually have Topsham clerk original documents signed by John Hunter, and the last one was dated on May 22nd, 1775. So I have some of the original town clerk documents that I'll share with the society.
Wonderful. Thank you.
That's great.
Anybody else want to feel free to unmute and ask a question or make a comment?
I was wondering about the drilling of the militia. I understood that down in Massachusetts, at any rate, in the late 1600s, if you bought property, that put you in the militia and there was no getting out of it. I wondered if that was, I guess it was the same here because Maine was part of Massachusetts, but you mentioned something about even 16-year-olds and so on. I guess, did that mean anybody in a household? But I guess there weren't any renters, right? That
Well, what I found was that every man from the age of 18 to 45 was compelled
Yeah.
to drill in military tactics 4 times a year.
Wow. Mm. Yeah.
Any final questions or comments? See a nice feedback in the chat box. Thank you. Amy's reminding folks Amy, our museum services manager, is reminding folks if you would like to sign up to stay abreast of everything we're doing, just info@pejepscothistorical.org. We'll put you on the list. All
Yeah.
right. Well,
Thank you,
whoops.
Jim. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Jim.
you very much, Jim. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We really appreciate the support today and hope to see you for another program soon.
Excellent job.
Thank you.
So thank you.
All right. And that's a wrap. Everybody have a great rest of your day and have a great weekend.